Well, it's that time of year again where we start to wonder, should Christians celebrate or participate in Halloween? Because if you're coming up on these videos, maybe they're in your feed, and I've gotten many of them. So I want to respond a little bit, not directly, but I'll respond to a multitude of them that I've heard. And this isn't normally my podcast. Normally go through books of the Bible or go through in-depth teaching that takes multiple podcasts. But what I want to cover is, should Christians celebrate Halloween? Studying in my doctoral studies, taking time out to do this. Don't have a lot of time, haven't posted a lot of podcasts, but I wanted to do this because I know a lot of you are concerned. A lot of you are worried. You see kind of two threads of videos that come out here. One is Christians need to be afraid and need to be concerned that they're being lured away into Halloween and into the culture and ultimately into evil. There's another view, another thread, where people that came out of a sinful, overtly sinful lifestyle, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They were intentionally trying to be sinful. They were intentionally doing it. And there were some things wrapped up into Halloween, especially that it was kind of darker. There were things that were involved with that. There was maybe drugs, sex, and there was things that were wrapped up into all these things. And you are wanting to say, man, you got to stay away from that, and you want to distance yourself. There's kind of those two different threads that I want to address, and we're going to talk about also the origins of Halloween. Where does it come from? Should we be involved with it? We're going to get right into it. First of all, I want to say I'm glad that you're here. If you just found our channel, our podcast, Requip Ministries. My name is Scott Schneiderman. This is meant to be only a supplement for the local church. I believe if you're a follower of Jesus, you're not meant to be alone. You're not meant to do Christianity on your own. You're supposed to be integrally related into the local church. Like that's the way Christianity is only meant to be. I like the way my pastor says it, that Christianity is a team sport. Truly believe that. And so want to call you into that. But we're talking about, should Christians be involved with Halloween? And since some of you have shared many videos, many of you have reached out to me, and I've just seen different videos. Well, I want to talk a little bit about this, and we're going to go into this. This is going to be a little bit in depth, but just enough where it's important, where you can gain this. You'll be able to follow along. And I want to help you with that. But if you have any questions, put it in the comments or just send them directly to them. You can find me on social media. You can go to my website and contact me in that way as well. And website link is there. And you will get all of that as well. But there's plenty of that I can say about this. But the first thing I want to say is, anytime you're studying, anytime you're looking into any of this, here's a principle. That correlation doesn't automatically mean causation. Meaning, just because something in the distant history correlates to something that almost seems like what we're doing today, doesn't necessarily mean each caused the other. It doesn't mean that something in the past caused something that we're doing in the present. I'll give you the flip side example of how people try to disprove Christianity. The way that they try to do it is they'll say, oh, Jesus rose from the grave. He died a martyr's death, but then he rose from the grave. That's interesting. That sounds a lot like this ancient, way before Jesus, this ancient myth from Egypt called Osiris and Horus, and it sounds a lot like that, like he died and he was resurrected. It sounds so much like that. So Christianity must have borrowed that to make Jesus into this deity type figure. There's plenty I can say on that, but don't have the time to completely show all of that. Plenty of documentation on that and how that is false, that just because those things correlate a little bit, which usually the facts are wrong, but just because those correlate, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. And in fact, it did not. But like most things in history, there's not just one simple way to talk about this because there's a lot of elements that may correlate to other cultures, but they do not necessarily cause one another. For example, as we talked about, Christianity didn't start from some pagan religion. But the question becomes, what about Halloween? Well, let's go back to the very beginning. There's a ancient Celtic holiday known as Saa-win. Well, and it began 1900 years ago in England and Northern Ireland and Northern France. And these things were celebrated. And it was this Celtic, yes, it was a harvest festival in a sense. And as things began to get dormant, as the leaves began to fall, as the harvest was going to come into play soon, they wanted to reap that harvest. They thought that because the physical world was breaking down in kind of the fabric of the physical world they believe was tearing apart, they believed that the spiritual world began to get a little bit more powerful. And in fact, these dark forces, they weren't all bad because, hey, you could be sort of on their side. You could appease them, you could celebrate them, and you could, yes, sacrifice to them. You could have these big bonfires and have this party because you're celebrating. And that's what they did. But I want to say this to you very clearly because you will hear that, and that is true. That is what happened with Samhain and in this ancient Celtic kind of religious festival that was mixed in with the culture. Yet you'll hear that a lot of times, and then people will make that massive logical fallacy leap and say because people back then believed falsely, right? That's not the truth, but they believed falsely that because the world was breaking down, that spiritual forces would have a foothold, so to speak, when we use Christian language with you. They'll have this foothold into you, and you've opened that door, and the demonic forces now can rush in because you're participating, because you're involved with. Now, yes, if you were involved with pagan sacrificial worship and killing of animals, you're sacrificing a goat in a pentagram in the middle of the forest somewhere, and there's a bunch of Wiccans around, and you're casting spells. Yes, that's wrong. Don't get involved with that. But that's not the same as going to your church's trunk or treat and handing out candy. That's not the same as dressing up in a costume and walking around your neighborhood and collecting candy. Those two things don't correlate. Those two things are not the same thing. And it's not as if because you're participating in this modern day thing we call Halloween, which we'll talk about the origins, we'll keep talking about it. It's not the same as you're opening up spiritual forces into your life. What does the Bible talk about opening up spiritual forces? Well, one clear example is where the Apostle Paul is reminding people, hey, don't let the sun go down on your anger. And why? Because he talks about it'll give the devil a foothold. Because bitterness is what he's talking about. When you don't resolve something, when you just talk about people instead of to people, bitterness begins to come up, and your assumptions about people become the realities that you believe. And when that is true, when you believe lies and you shape your mind in such ways, yes, it tells us, the Bible is clear that that opens you up to have a foothold from the enemy. So let's stick to the Bible. That thing is very clear. So if you're insulting, backbiting, gossiping, having wrong assumptions about people and not talking to people, but just talking about people around them, you're giving the enemy a foothold. But let's talk about, man, where does Halloween actually talk? Because all we've talked about so far is Samhain. So where does that leap come from? Where does that ancient holiday that most of us had never even heard about, that happened 1900 years ago and isn't really celebrated in any kind of popular, well-known way today or in the last several hundred years, where's the correlation and causation? Where is the connection to Halloween? So let's get into that a little bit. So Samhain remained a popular holiday until St. Patrick and other missionaries came to Ireland and began to share the gospel that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, that no matter what you've done, no matter what evil you've been involved with, even pagan worship, no matter what it is, drunken parties, you've been involved in sexual immorality, anything like that, any type of other sin, you've been gossiping about somebody, you've had greedy, selfish ambition and motives, and you've stolen, all these things, Jesus died for you. And he crucified those to the cross. And when you put your faith in him, he makes you clean. You're perfectly clean. And on the third day, Jesus rose from the dead, showing that he has conquered Satan, sin, and death. And we don't have to be afraid of the demonic forces. We don't have to be afraid of Satan when we stay close to Jesus, when we don't wander away, when we stay close to him. And that was the message that St. Patrick brought. And as Christianity got popular, meaning people converted to Christianity, people put their faith in Jesus, this formerly popular holiday, Samhain, got less popular. Why? Because people weren't interested in appeasing these fake gods that are out there. They weren't interested in doing that. They were Christians, but they still had things in their culture that they liked to celebrate that were morally neutral. Yes, the enemy, Satan, latched onto these neutral things and he used them for evil, but these people still had these morally neutral things they liked doing. Meaning they liked to get together. They liked to have a good time and enjoy and celebrate things. Of course, that's human. That's what we all do. So people used to do this, and then it got less popular. Okay, but where's the connection? Well, as these things began to get popular and Christianity began to grow and grow and grow, and Samhain was less popular, obviously, with the Christians, but there were still a lot of people that weren't Christians. So what did they do? Well, St. Patrick's and others and these type of figures, these missionaries. So the church in the 8th century, in fact, created this day called All Saints' Day. And it was when? November 1st. To recognize us going forward. But how? Looking back and looking at all the saints that have passed before. Think of great cloud of witnesses. And we're celebrating, saying, man, we love that all that they did because of all that these people, that the faith has passed on. They shared the gospel, and eventually it came to you and me, and we're in this community, and we believe because of all them, and let's celebrate them. And just like we have today, New Year's Day is kind of a holiday, but nobody really celebrates that holiday. It's not really that big popular. I mean, you might be off of work. But the holiday, the celebration, is really the night before. It's on the eve. Well, and that's exactly what Halloween became. It was the eve of All Saints' Day. And so Christians began to celebrate and have a great time. And they, yes, mixed in cultural, neutral things that weren't overtly or intentionally sinful in any way, but just cultural practices. And yes, they dressed up and they had candy and they had bonfires and they had a good time, but they weren't sinning overtly. They weren't worshiping some other god. There was no connection there. There was nothing connected those things. But in fact, they had this festival, they had this Halloween, and they had this All Saints' Day as a way to be a cultural bridge and introduce people that were far away from Jesus to say, look, this is just a step. Just a step closer to hear the gospel. And churches do that today. They have trunk or treats, or they have harvest festivals, or maybe in the past, I would go to church, they would call it Halloween. Like, hey, go celebrate Halloween, let's just do it at the church. Why? Because it's a way to bring people in. The same spirit, the same way that the earlier church around the 8th century in Ireland and so on, in England, the way they wanted to reach out to the culture that was far away from Jesus, they used this holiday. And that's exactly what they did. And a lot of churches do that today. We even see this in the Bible. You say, well, you shouldn't use culture. You shouldn't use Um, well, even in the Bible, Acts chapter 17, one of the first examples that I'm aware of anyway, Paul is a missionary traveling around to other cultures that weren't Christian and weren't even Jewish. He went to Athens in this case. He went to the Athenians, and they'd never heard of Jesus. They'd never heard of, they probably knew Jews around, but they had no real cultural connection, and maybe they heard some of the stories, but there was no connection there. So in fact, in Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul quotes from multiple poets that are pagan to make his point and draw them in to tell them about the gospel of Jesus. In fact, to point them to the truth and fact of Jesus' resurrection, to sort of spark their interest. But he used that cultural bridge. Just like Halloween was made, he used that cultural bridge. Another example, in sort of modern day, 16, 17, 1800s, they had these bar tunes and these taverns, and they had these songs. Well, they began to put these same songs, and they put Christian theology in them. And we today call them hymns. We call them holy. But they were old bar tunes, and they used the culture. They used morally neutral things that the culture, people in the culture could grasp what was happening. And they used those to draw them in. And yet another example that nobody even thinks about, that nobody even knows. Christianity, when it started, was people that only met in homes, and it was Jewish primarily. They would have celebrated all the feast days. Why? Because it was in their culture. They would do all these things. They would go to the synagogue. They would hear from a rabbi. They would also then hear some interpretation from their Christian brothers and sisters. And there were these apostles that went into the synagogue to say, no, this is really what it's about. But the way they would just sort of meet in a big circle, and someone would sit or stand, and they would read from the scriptures, the Old Testament. But moving to modern day, as the theater and plays began to get more and more popular, Christians and churches decided, well, this is some of the culture that they understand. So let's start making our church buildings a little bit more like an amphitheater or a theater, where there are seats in rows, maybe fanning out, but it's seats in rows, and they're all facing to a choir or someone playing an instrument or someone speaking and preaching a message, like they're watching a play. They kept the message of the gospel, but presenting it in a way the culture can then get. It's the same reason we use this technology to get directly to you, because you're already on these platforms, and we want you to hear the truth. So throughout history, God has caused people in the church, and use some of the culture, use some neutral, morally neutral things. Don't get involved with sin. God never tells you that. But morally neutral things to draw people in to hear the gospel. So interestingly, the name Halloween is Christian in a way, not meaning it's in the Bible in any kind of way. I'm not saying that, but it's from church history. So when people say Halloween is cultic, demonic, pagan, well, that's not really true. That's actually not technically accurate at all. It's not. Halloween was never those things, because Halloween was a Christian word, meaning not in the Bible, but from Christians that used this tool to reach out to people that didn't yet believe. So that's categorically false. Saa-win, yes, was pagan, but it does not have a direct connection to Halloween. Those are two separate things, and as I talked about, meant for two very clearly different purposes. There is nothing inherently sinful. People dressing up in costumes, collecting candy, those things are morally neutral things. Now, If you're involved with witchcraft, you're involved with a Ouija board, you're involved with anything demonic like that, yeah, do nothing. Get away from that as much as possible. And I'm going to use an example from the Bible, a couple examples, and really clear this thing up because I'm not saying that you should be involved with any of those things that are inherently sinful, of course. However, there will be judgmental, legalistic Christians guaranteed that are going to pop up in your feed and say these things. But the Apostle Paul, in fact, dealt with many people like that. In fact, he was somebody like that. And if we're not careful, we all can tend to go in that direction. So the Apostle Paul talking to the Colossian church, and he says in chapter 2, verse 16, it says, "Therefore, do not let anybody judge you on what you eat or drink or regard to a religious festival or a new moon celebration or a Sabbath day." Now, the context of this passage is this is where they would participate, this Christian church. Apparently, they were participating in cultural holdovers from their previous life, meaning things they used to do that really have been so ingrained in their culture, they just sort of carried it on. And it's sort of a religious tradition. Don't let anybody judge you according to it. Not meaning don't go out and just yell at everybody, "You stop judging me, you shouldn't do this." Okay, whatever. But what he's saying is just because people think incorrectly that because you're have these cultural holdovers that you're somehow less than a Christian or maybe you're not a Christian, well, that's obviously false because you're saved by grace through faith, believing in Jesus Christ, not because the things you do or don't do. Those don't make you a Christian. If you do, it's legalism, and it's not Christianity. It's a fake religion that somebody brings up, but they might just attach Jesus to their fake religion. But, for example, we are keenly aware of the day of our birth. Let me give you something that you do culturally that you don't even know, that you bring things in that are maybe cultural. It's not inherently bad. Everybody's keenly aware of the day of their birth. Now, that is a relatively modern thing. Most people throughout history would not have known the date of their birth. I don't know if you knew that, but we are keenly aware. Why? Because we study our birth certificates. We're really into genealogy. Well, we kind of are, but it's not just that. It's because we have a birthday. We have a birthday party celebrating us, celebrating me, celebrating you on your birthday, and we do it every year. And we've done it since we were kids. Maybe you were in a particular family you didn't, but you are the absolute minority. Almost everybody in the United States celebrates the day of their birth. Is that inherently wrong? No, of course not. But it is a cultural holdover that before you were a Christian, it was just brought in because it was just part of your culture, just something you celebrate. And I can't find anywhere in the Bible where you are mandated to celebrate your birthday. There's also nowhere in the Bible where it explicitly said, don't celebrate your birthday. And that's what Paul is saying with a new moon festival or a Sabbath day. These are cultural holdovers from the Old Testament Mosaic system, Jewish cultural holdover that had no connection with your salvation, that had no connection with being a Christian, a follower of Jesus in the new covenant. But they did some of these things. So Paul doesn't chastise them for doing this and saying, you're sinning, you're participating with evil. No, he says, it's basically implied you're doing these things, but don't let anybody judge you for these because that's just silly. It's just cultural holdovers that you're bringing in. They are morally neutral things. So now I want to get into just a couple of scriptures that are always used. And often they're used out of context. So I want to get into that. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11 is one of them. It says, take no part in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead expose them. And people's conclusion is, therefore, see, you shouldn't celebrate Halloween because that's evil. You're participating in unfruitful deeds of darkness. Already explained, Halloween has no connection with unfruitful deeds of darkness unless you're actually participating in unfruitful deeds of darkness. What are those things? The Bible is clear with all the things: sexual immorality, greed, idolatry, slander. I could go on, but the list is endless. All these things that are clearly fruit of sinful desire. Very clear. It's a popular verse that's always attached to this, and I love people's zeal. I love it. However, it's misplaced because that verse has absolutely nothing to do clearly with Halloween, but also with anything that has any connection with anything like that. So Paul is actually starting off the chapter, and he says, "Follow me as I follow Christ." He starts off that chapter, and it's not, they're involved with something where they have no understanding of the origin. That's not what it is. They're not falling into something and getting slipped away. No, they are intentionally conducting sinful behavior. That's it. That's what it's talking about. It's not, oh, you kind of celebrated or participated in something and then you got swept away. No, that's not at all what it's talking about. I'll give you another example of how you expose them, because he's basically saying, have nothing to do with these evil deeds, but expose them. And then he goes on to say, well, follow me as I'll follow Christ, and then tells you about don't live like them, but live like a child of light. So how do you expose them? It's not by being one of these guys on the internet that's pointing out all these quote-unquote sinful behaviors that they think other people do. And by the way, no one's ever been saved by confessing someone else's sin, like it's never happened. And no one ever is set free from confessing someone else's sin, but only when you confess your sin and when I confess my sin that we become free. And so that's what he's saying. And I'll give you an example of how this can work out, how I've seen this. Early on, when I became a Christian, one of the things that God set me free of was using foul language, cussing, and degrading people, and all these things. Having vulgar talk and all this. So, I've never once, when I'm within my peers, maybe at a workplace or anything like that, do I tell people, don't cuss around me. You shouldn't cuss. Cussing's sin. Cussing's bad. I don't do that. I don't have to. I have no desire to do that. Instead, I live for Christ. I just live how in different contexts that have been, different jobs before I was a pastor, just in regular type jobs. Eventually, around a lot of non-Christians, people say, hey, Scott, why don't you cuss so much? Why don't you talk like we talk? And then I have an opportunity to share the gospel. And they'll also self-censor. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't talk about that. I shouldn't say that around you. I don't ever tell them. Why? Because God is exposing them, because he's causing me to act like a child of light. That's how you expose it. Not by being these people that call out all these ministries that are like, oh, I'm going to call out this person. I'm going to call out this person. I'm going to be against this and against this. That's not exposing darkness. It isn't. Not according to the Bible, but just living like Christ exposes darkness when you're in a relationship with people and they see, man, there's something different. The Bible even tells us in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is in you when you're asked, but do it in gentleness and respect. The implication is someone's going to ask. Why? Because something is different. Because you're a child of light. You're acting very different. Now, I'm going to give you the next one. It's a popular verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 21. It says, you cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot participate in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. This one now could be applicable. It could have something to do with it. And Paul is addressing a messed up, a messy church, the Corinthian church that In the first century, that is all messed up. They had all the spiritual gifts. They put their faith in Jesus. They were transformed. But they still had a lot of sinful things that they were getting involved with. And apparently they had some sort of mix between communion and food that was sacrificed to idols. Where Paul basically is saying, really, that's probably just demonic forces. They don't know that. They think they're gods, but they're being sacrificed to those. So he's saying, just don't participate in that. In other places, and later on, he says, it's not going to do anything to you, but it's not beneficial to you. Everything is permissible, he says, but not everything is beneficial. So he's saying it doesn't make you unchristian, but it's just not fruitful. It just really doesn't help you. So anybody that's using those scare tactics in videos, well, if you participate with this, if you do this, you're not a Christian. That is not even biblical. That's not even what he's saying here. It has nothing to do with what he's saying. He's just saying it's really not helpful to you. But he's even taken a step further that has nothing to do with Halloween, as we already talked about. No connection with demonic forces unless you're explicitly involved with those things. Now, I want to give you one more application as we begin to close this thing out. Is how does it apply to us? How do we make sense of this? Well, if you're thinking of going to a party, maybe they're calling it a Halloween party, they're calling it a harvest party, I don't care what the name is. If you know, or if when you get there, there's drunkenness, there's sexual stuff going on, there's orgies, there's foulness, just all this. I don't have to list all the sins because you probably know what they are. If you're getting involved to that and you're like, well, but it's Halloween, and I remember that preacher man on the TV said it was kind of Christian, so I should probably go. No, you probably shouldn't. That would be participating with sinful things. Really not a wise place for you to be. Now, if your church does a trunk or treat, a harvest party, harvest festival, whatever, or maybe they just call it Halloween, and that, whatever, they call it that because that's a Christian name. Maybe they call it that. But their purpose is to reach out to the community. That it could be kind of like a pre-step, a step into the church where they can see, oh man, these are the Christians. They can then relate to one another. And then, as God's word says, you can have this opportunity to share the good news. If that's the purpose, I would say be a part of it. Be all for that. But if you don't have a clear conscience, and it's individual, the Bible's clear, you should have a clear conscience. If, as it talks about in other places, where if there's food sacrificed to idols and you're afraid that you know it's nothing, but you have such a connection to that and you just can't mentally get over that, I would say for your conscience sake, don't be involved with that. But also, that doesn't mean you're on a mission to make your conviction everyone else's. No, that's an individual conviction. So I hope this has been beneficial to you. I spent some time here, got into this, talked a lot about this. It's been beneficial. Share this with somebody that needs it. We always welcome if you subscribe and like this so you can get the next one. And thank you for being part of it.